Hello guys. In this video I'm taking a break from finishing off my ongoing projects to build this 1/35th scale Italeri DUKW or DUK, which was used by Allied forces during World War II. This particular boxing is a 2023 re-release, but the tooling for this kit dates all the way back to 2002. Those boxings have featured slightly different markings, American and British versions, and slight modifications for the various variants of the DUK. DUKs were developed in 1942 and used by the US Army and the US Marine Corps, as well as the British and the Soviets. They saw a wide range of action, including the Operation Husky invasion of Sicily and during the Allied landings in Normandy. After the war, the Americans made use of DUKs in the Korean War, and the British used them in some of their colonial interests, including Malaya. Apparently they were also quite popular in civilian use for tourist sightseeing purposes. This kit really jumped out at me because you might remember I recently 3D printed a DUK, but then I realised that there were some intellectual property issues with the source of that model, and so I didn't really feel that it was ethical for me to go through the painting and building process with that 3D printed version. So instead I picked this kit up, and it was one of those kits that I just really felt like opening and building as soon as I got it. It looked like a nice build. The plastic reminded me kind of Tamiya plastic, and I built this basically in about 2 afternoons. And as you'll see in a moment when we look at the instructions, we have a good range of options for painting this kit. So looking at the instruction book, and one of the things that really jumped out at me was the apparent simplicity of the main body build. We have this upper piece here for the upper hull. We have a lower hull piece and then 2 side pieces, and that really is the majority of the body of the vehicle done. The rest is simply detailing. So this made it one of those kits where you really feel like you're making progress quite quickly. As you'll see in the video, I didn't really follow the sequence of these instructions, which would have you build up all the detail on the top first, then build up the bottom and the sides with their detail, and then add the top to the bottom and the sides. Instead, I thought it made much more sense to get the bulk of the vehicle done, get those 4 pieces together, make sure all the joints are square and well done, no gaps, and then start to add a detail afterwards. Because if you're trying to shoehorn pieces into place with lots of detail on, you can pretty much guarantee something's going to get broken. Looking at the paint schemes, the first one is a British scheme, British Royal Army, France 1944. And although Italeri give us that flat Euro 1 dark green there as the code name for their paints, I'm guessing, that should probably be SCC 15, which is the British version of olive drab. And of course at that stage of the war, British vehicles are wearing the Allied star. The second option is another olive drab version, which is the US Army version, unknown unit, Rhine River crossing, Germany, 1945. As I say, another olive drab option there. The third option is a much more colourful option. This is a Pacific option with the US Marine Corps, and it features that 3 colour camouflage there, which would be the olive drab base coat, the yellow sandy colour there is number 6 earth yellow, and the red colour is number 8 earth red. That's a really nice colourful option, I do like that one. Finally, the option number 4 is another American option, Utah Beach, Normandy, June 1944, again overall olive drab with just slightly different markings compared to the other European US option. So here's a quick look at the instructions and how I approached it in the video. So step 6 has the fully detailed upper hull. I just left that without the details. Then I decided to move on to step 7, which is putting the lower hull and the sides together. And then step 13, which has those 2 parts together, minus all of the detail that you can see in here. And you can see what I mean here by these huge parts. Massive single piece moulding for both the top and the bottom. Pretty respectable quality though, and all the eject pin marks are on the right side, the invisible sides. Here are the side pieces, again absolutely huge. The real duck was 31 feet or 9.45 meters long, so yeah, this is big. Before I started to add the top to the bottom, I did have to make sure that I put this footwell piece into position because it fits in from below, and that has the pedals and the mount for the steering column. The fitting of the sides to the bottom of the hull was not perfect. There are some tabs to get the vertical position correct, but there still is a little bit of play backwards and forwards. So with these things I find it's always best to do them both at the same time so you can get them lined up nicely and then tape around them to squeeze them together. And as you can see in that shot there, I've been very liberal with the Tamiya cement on the inside because you're never going to see that anyway. And at that point, although I didn't glue the top into place, I did place it in to help ensure those sides were in the correct position. While that was taped together and drying up, I worked on the engine access hatch. This is where I should have probably read the instructions a bit more carefully, because after putting the engine hatch in place, I realised that the front windshield piece has to go in first, because there's a small overlap. Luckily the glue wasn't dry, so I prised that engine hatch open and did things in the correct order. I was also able to put the dashboard into position, which wasn't a great fit. It wasn't super clear where it had to go. I think the whole windshield area was probably the least well-fitting part of this kit, but still nothing major. One thing that did confuse me was this grille here. You can see it fits this way in, lining up with those vertical bars, and then we've got the bulkhead for the cargo compartment. Now, if you look at that vent piece, you'll see there are two notches in it, which would make it seem like something goes in there, but according to the instructions it goes in this way. It doesn't go in with the notches lining up like that, which is a little bit odd to me. But I did check my references and that is correct. It does go with the blank side towards those notches. However, before I put either of those pieces into place, I needed to paint some black paint on the inside of that dark well down there so that we won't be able to look through and see the plastic in the finished model. Here I am dry fitting the walls of the cargo compartment, and a bit like the main hull itself, I figured it was best to get all four of these into position at the same time, because of course they all touch each other, they all intersect with each other. It's best to glue everything up and then sort out any errors or potential errors while the glue is still slightly wet. With that cargo bay done, the lion's share of the vehicle is complete, and it's really now just about adding details. One of those details are the driving controls. We've got a number of gear sticks, handbrakes, things like that. I'm guessing controls to switch from land to water mode and so on. I decided at this stage not to attach those, partly because it would be hard to paint them, and partly because they would block the paint from the airbrush when trying to paint the footwell. And I had a feeling that access to the footwell would already be a little bit difficult. The seats are moulded largely as a single piece with just the backing place to be added separately. The 7 wheels, including the spare, are simply 2 halves with a small seam line down the middle that will need cleaning up. There are a couple of configurations apparently of the rear deck of the Duck. Here with the wheel on the right hand side and the jerry cans will be on the left hand side there. I believe this indicates a slightly later version. We've got a few tools that go on the front as well. Incidentally, on the underside of this top piece there were a number of marks that looked like they were drill holes, but the manual doesn't mention drilling through any of those, at least for this version. I know some of the previous releases of this Italeri kit have been for the British version or with a slightly different modification with a machine gun on top, so perhaps they were for those versions. The suspension and drive shaft assemblies were surprisingly sturdy, apart from when I broke off a piece on this one. I did glue the front one in position at this stage, but left the rear one, being bigger, because it's obviously got 4 wheels, off for separate painting to allow me to get into all those nooks and crannies on the underside. In the same manner, although I fitted the drive shaft for the propeller, I left the propeller itself off for now. We've got a number of hooks and tie downs on the side of the vehicle. The front and rear ones are particularly important because the fabric bumpers that go there do attach to those. At the rear we do have this small gap here which will be covered by the winch, although it needs to be filled first. And yes, I realise at this point in the video that I have placed that winch in backwards, and it should of course be going in that gap. But nevertheless, that seam line below does need to be filled and sanded before I do that. As I mentioned earlier, the whole windshield area was a little bit poorly fitting. And as you can see here, even with some tape to try and clamp everything down and pull it in position, we've got that gap there just below the windshield corner. It's not really a place that you can clamp things manually, so instead I simply use some Vallejo plastic putty to fill that gap. At the very front of the vehicle is the splash guard. The instructions only cover that in the deployed or up position, but once the duck is on the road, that's going to be down, of course, to aid visibility. And I was able to shoehorn that into position on the engine deck. These front bumpers are 3 pieces in total, a centre piece and a left and right piece. I've glued them together here. I'll leave them separate for painting, but they do attach to the front, and then you can see there the bumpers with the 2 ropes on them go around that hook that I mentioned earlier. Well, here are our sub-assemblies for painting. So we've got the seats and the wheels. We've got that rear suspension system. We've got the front bumpers, the 2 rear bumpers, some jerry cans, the steering wheel and the anchor. And that's it really. Apart from that, everything else is ready to paint. So with that in mind, I gave everything a coat of Tamiya grey primer, followed by some light panel line pre-shading using XF69, which is NATO black. I try to focus this on the panel lines, of course, so in the rear cargo area in particular there, but also on the sides where we have those quite big ridges. I tried to put a black line under those to sort of enhance the shadows. I then used AK Real Colours Olive Drab to give everything its first coat of paint. What I found quite interesting here was this top colour compared to this bottom colour here. This is the same colour paint. I clearly just put more layers on the bottom there. It's come out a much more green colour compared to the top where it's almost a yellowy brown colour. I'm not a huge fan of that yellow-brown colour there, so I did add an extra layer of the olive drab shortly. Nevertheless, I think the duck was starting to take shape, and with the wheels in position as well, it looks really nice. It's a lovely little vehicle and something that you don't often see modelled. In the kit you get 2 jerry cans. I did paint a couple of extra 3D printed ones, which you can see here. Believe it or not, these were all painted with the same AK Real Colours Olive Drab. They were all given a black base first, and then simply by varying the thinning ratio and how many layers of the paint I added, I managed to get this range here of olive drab colours. This is literally just the black base and a single olive drab paint, which I was quite pleased with. Here you can see the duck again. Now I've given the top another coat of that initial olive drab to sort of green it up a little bit like the underside. You can see here I've put down some VMS gloss varnish in the areas where the decals will go, and I haven't done a very good job of that. I'm not quite sure what went wrong. User error, I'm sure. I think perhaps I hit it with slightly too high air pressure, maybe combined with slightly too low a temperature. Either way, it was time to apply the decals. I probably should say at this point that I've gone for one of the US European campaign schemes here, obviously with olive drab. Originally I was going to go for the Pacific scheme because I like the colourful pattern there. However, in a future video I'm going to be adding some things and some figures to the back of this duck, and they are European figures, they're not Pacific figures. Don't worry though if you like this specific theme, because I do have the 1/56 scale LVT from Rubicon Models, and that will definitely be done in this Pacific camouflage scheme. There are relatively few details that need painting on this vehicle. The seats are one obvious example, which were painted with Vallejo model colour khaki, and the included jerry cans were painted a slightly different colour green because of course it's highly unlikely that they'd be the exact same shade of olive drab as the vehicle. Some details on the dashboard. I always find the easiest way to paint these dials is to thin the paint a bit more than normal, and then when you put it into the recess for the dial it tends to run and fill the space automatically. A nice trick when you're painting tools that are already attached to the vehicle is to slide some spare paper. This is the covering that often comes with decals under the tool, and that will stop any paint getting onto the model itself. These corner bumpers were a bit hard to put in place and hold the model and film at the same time, but hopefully you can see there that I've managed to get them more or less in the right place, and the rope attachment pieces kind of look like they're going around the appropriate hooks. And then, although I'm not a huge fan of chipping, I figured that we probably would need some form of scrapes and chips in the cargo area. Of course, ducks were used to carry all kinds of things, and it's unlikely that this would be pristine. I did consider doing a hairspray technique here with some chipping with a slightly different colour, olive drab, but in the end I went with some brush painted streaks and scratches, followed by some quite heavy sponge chipping with a slightly lighter olive drab colour, and this was made simply by taking original olive drab and adding a small amount of yellow to it. Of course, while I'm doing this I'm rotating the sponge so we don't get the same pattern of marks all the way across the flatbed. That same lighter olive drab was used to highlight any of the raised areas like the bolt heads and so on. It does look quite stark here, but as you'll see in the final photos it is toned down quite a lot. The horizontal ridges on the side of the duck are quite prominent and quite a key feature. So I took some of that lightened olive drab again and dry brushed it over those raised pieces. I then took some sepia oil paint, thinned with odourless thinner, and did a pin wash. You can see here I'm getting quite a lot of tide marks. That's partly because the model is matte varnished and partly because I've used a bit too much thinner. To reduce the tide marks you can blend them in afterwards, and a matte varnish will sort out the rest. My final weathering technique was some oil paint splattering, using the same Abteilung sepia oil paint. I've done this on a few models now, and it's not trying to emulate mud or anything like that, it's simply trying to break up that uniform surface colour. Once that was done, I gave everything another coat of VMS flat varnish, and then this stage of the modelling was complete. So there we go guys, that was my building and painting of the Italeri duck in 1/35th scale. I really like this vehicle, this was a fun little build. I'm really glad I took a break from my ongoing projects to have a go at this. You might notice it's not completely finished. We haven't got any weathering really, especially on the wheels. I forgot to add the anchor to the back and a few other bits and pieces. That's because I am going to add some cargo to this as well, and I've got some figures. The figures didn't come with the kit, but I think they do suit it pretty much perfectly. So you can look out for that in a future video. In the meantime, I would like to say thank you to all of you for watching. Special thanks to my Patreon supporters and YouTube members. Their names are on the screen now. I hope the start of the new year has been a good one for you. Thank you again for watching, and until next time, have fun modelling.